China. You believe almost the exact opposite of nearly the entire investment community on China. Tell us about it.
I think China's a basket case waiting to blow up. China's importing a lot of commodities. They're producing a lot of goods and services that the Chinese economy can't afford. The people in China aren't buying. They're producing these things for export at a time when export demand is shrinking in both Europe and the United States. That's not a good thing. They are pumping money supply like mad. Money supply in China is running about 30% a year annualized. The biggest rampant supply of money growth anywhere in the world is happening right now in China. They're building malls. They're building entire cities. They are building condo complexes that no one can afford, and these places are sitting there vacant. So eventually, this has to stop. China's keeping this going right now, hoping that the global economy picks up, but all the signs that I see in the United States, in Europe, in Spain, in Greece, in Portugal, in Ireland, in Italy suggest that consumers are not ready to pick up the spending. China's a disaster waiting to happen.
And you write that trillions in RMB loans are now going bad. What will happen to the banks in China?
It's hard to say the exact state of the banks over there, other than we can say the banking system is insolvent globally. Certainly the United States banking system is insolvent. I believe the UK banks are insolvent. I think the banks in Ireland, in Iceland, those banks we know are insolvent. Everyone somehow thinks that this command economy in China is okay, when the big difference there is when the Chinese banks say lend, the banks lend, and the lending doesn't have to make any sense, but it'll keep on going as long as the government says for the banks to lend. Here in the United States, some point comes along, and we hit it, where it stops. And in a command economy, it doesn't. So China's overheating. They're going to have to cut back. When they cut back, there's going to be riots. So, or mass disruptions, unrest, political unrest that China does not want to see. So they're in between a rock and a hard place right now, and I don't see an easy way out. And yet, capital money is flowing into China because of its so-called, GDP that's going up. But China counts GDP differently than the rest of the world. When China spends money, it doesn't matter whether it produces any goods from that or not. It immediately goes on the bottom line as an increase in GDP. So China's money supply is going up, GDP is going up, whether or not any of that's malinvestment or whether or not it's producing anything at all. It's hard to say.
You bring up China's money, which of course is the RMB. Now, much of the ongoing friction between U.S. and China arises from the demands by the U.S. for China to revalue the RMB. What do you think will happen if RMB floated freely?
That's a good question. What will happen, first off, they're going to resist, but the U.S. ought to be careful about what it's asking for. If China revalues, if China floated the yuan, first off, there's no guarantee that the renminbi or the yuan, as it's locally called, would rise. What's happened is hedge funds have poured a massive amount of money into China that's sitting there in these Chinese banks, that they're just waiting for this reevaluation to occur. And when this reevaluation occurs, they're going to pull all of this money right back out. That's actually one reason why China needs to keep all of those reserves that it's keeping. People, you keep hearing the statement, well, why doesn't China do something smart instead of sitting there holding on to all of these dollars? Why don't they buy oil? Well, no one ever bothers to ask, well, what is Iran or Saudi Arabia going to do with those dollars? I mean, eventually those dollars have to come back home. But technically, China needs to hold those dollars because the hedge funds and other investors are holding this money over there in China, waiting for this reevaluation to pull this money out as soon as this happens. So here we have this deadly embrace kind of thing where everyone's betting on the renminbi to rise, and the United States is putting pressure on China to reevaluate upwards, which is causing more money to flow into China to take advantage of this. And once they raise, it's all going to exit, and we're going to see this crash. So we are building to some sort of crash scenario here in the renminbi.
And yet, speaking of crash scenarios, the two biggest economies in the world, the U.S. and China, appear to be engaged in a beggar-thy-neighbor trade war, very similar to what happened during the Great Depression.
This is exactly a beggar-thy-neighbor kind of scenario. But everyone's doing it. It's not just China. It's happening in Europe. It's happening in the UK. But the deadly embrace is U.S. and Japan and U.S. and China. And it certainly is. I mean, the U.S. is begging China to. The U.S. wants to weaken the dollar to increase exports, and China wants to do the same thing. And of course, so does Japan, and so does Europe, and so does Germany, Iceland, everywhere. Japan's in a hard strait because of their aging population and a demographic. And they are selling, their population has finally reached a point where they're no longer savings. Their population is so aged that they have to cash in on all of these bonds. The pension funds in Japan are now net sellers of Japanese treasuries. So we have all of these things coming to a head. We've got a huge property bubble in Australia that's ready to blow up. We've got a property bubble in Canada that's ready to blow up. We've got property bubbles still that are have already blown up in Spain that are causing unemployment to be hitting 20%. In the United States, we've got 10 or 11 million people that are unemployed, looking for a job, that want a job, and I don't see it. I don't see any source of jobs. We've got these entire global confluence of problems that are all coming to a head all at once, and on top of that, we've got massive union and pension problems here in the United States that are starting to make the United States resemble what is happening right now in Greece.
You mentioned pension problems. The baby boom generation, of course, is beginning to retire, or trying to. Didn't governments around the world essentially promise citizens great retirements without the need to save?
Oh, absolutely. And that is yet another problem here that's really severe in the United States, more so than anywhere else in the world. We have these huge pension promises that have been made, mainly to the unions, and taxes keep having to rise to support those unions, yet there's so actually very few people percentage-wise in these unions. So you got taxes going up on the non-unions to support the few that are getting these luxurious benefits. Everyone else is hurting, and the average person that's not in union without these benefits thought that they had enough money saved up in their retirement, or thought that their home would be their retirement, neither of which is true. So now you have a very serious issue of all these people that we expected to be retired can no longer afford to retire. So we've got senior citizens who are now effectively competing against their kids and grandkids for jobs. You can see it when you walk into any Walmart. You can see it when you walk into those kinds of stores. Just look at the age, the average age of the person, the greeter at Walmart. Is that person working because they want to be working, or is that person working because they have to work? I think to an extent a lot of it is the latter. So this big burst of boomers that everyone thought was going to be retiring now isn't, and they're competing with kids coming out of college that are coming out of college $200,000 in debt or more with no job. They don't have a job. They're moving back home. Apartment rents are falling. This is the massive deflationary scenario that I've been talking about, that the next leg down of it, I believe, is starting now, or if it's not starting now, it's going to soon start. Meanwhile, we have Bernanke, we've got Geithner, we've got all these people talking about this recovery that's coming, and they're saying, well, it's weak. Well, there is no recovery coming, and it indeed is weak, and it's far weaker than what these guys are admitting or know. It's hard to say whether they're lying or they're just stupid.
Okay, Mitch, that's all the time we have for. Thanks for being on the edge.